Oh, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar here at the Harriman Institute. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College and the current director of the Harriman Institute. And it is an absolute privilege to welcome four of Harriman's finest brain trust today to offer their observations on the Biden administration's policy towards Russia. We have had a lot of movement in the political affairs of both the United States and Russia, I would say, over the last couple of weeks. And so I'm incredibly grateful to our four speakers for joining us today to get their expertise on what to expect and what we should focus on in this new era, if it is to be a new era in U.S.-Russian relations. Let me just briefly mention a couple of ground rules here. I will introduce the speakers in the order that they give their talks, about remarks in a minute, about the 8-minute range. If you would like to participate in our Q&A towards the end of the session, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. Also, tell us your name as well. And who the question is directed to. And we'll try and fit in as many questions as you can. If you're on YouTube, please type in your questions to YouTube, and these will be relayed to us over here on the Zoom platform. So thank you again for joining us in your lunch hour. And our first panelist today is Dr. Robert Legvold. Bob is the Marshall D. Shulman Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University, where he specialized in the international relations of the post-Soviet states. He was also director of the Institute from 1986 to 1992, and always engaged in and involved in a number of different initiatives that all focus on U.S.-Russian relations and fostering understanding. So, Bob, we are particularly grateful to you for your insights today. And what should we be looking for in this new Biden era? Take it away.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for organizing the event. It's a great pleasure to be back with my Columbia colleagues. Two starting points for me. First, it's obviously a reset of the relationship is not the objective. The obstacles are too great and the basis is currently non-existent. But secondly, the Russian challenge is and will remain formidable and complex. I think that challenge includes significant threats to our national interest, including threats to our national security. With that proposition as the beginning, let me offer the first of three recommendations for the incoming administration. The first would be to revisit the assumptions that underlie policy and that have been prevalent for the last now 8 to 10 years. The dominant view in the Congress, the media, and I believe in the incoming Biden administration, sees Russian foreign policy as principally a function of the regime's overriding drive to preserve the venal autocratic system that Putin and his closest supporters have built. Those with an alternative view do not doubt the obvious, that a first-order concern of Putin and those who command power is to preserve the system they control. But they do not believe this impulse is the only or perhaps even the decisive one driving Russian behavior. They believe that Putin and those around him act in pursuit of a set of national foreign policy and national security goals that have legitimacy with dominant portions of the Russian elite in public, whether or not they're viewed as legitimate by those of us on the outside. And crucially, that these goals are shaped as much, if not more, by developments in Russia's international environment and interactions with key players than by the need to protect a kleptocratic regime. The other view that I began with would argue that the two are inseparable. I'd quickly add the difference is not over the nature of the Putin regime. All but those at the extreme left know who he and they are. That's clear from the assassinations and most recently the poisoning of Navalny, the practice of subverting and bludgeoning weaker near neighbors, and the regime's increasing repression, as well as the corruption not merely tolerated, but engineered, and engineered with effects that contaminate far beyond Russia. My second recommendation, I think the administration should reaffirm and rebalance a strategy that combines deterrence with détente, or if you will, deterrence with cooperation. The reaffirming part means not just mouthing the phrase one more time, but thinking it through conceptually. And rebalancing means adjusting the relative weight of the two sides. The deterrent side of the strategy, in my view, has three elements, and all three need to be adjusted. First, national defense. At the level of conventional forces, there needs to be more careful integration of the NATO buildup with arms control, including a return to Open Skies Treaty and new forms of confidence-building measures. At the nuclear level, I believe the administration should integrate the planned modernization of our nuclear forces with a doctrinal shift to sole purpose and a move away from a nuclear strategy that incorporates limited nuclear options. Second, I think we need to refine and enhance our capacity to conduct hybrid warfare, including information warfare. And third, I think we should raise cybersecurity to the top level of national security threats, and then make negotiating a regime of mutual restraint a first order of business. The focus should be on the threat to infrastructure, not everything else that's involved with the cybersecurity problem. Threat to infrastructure, including electoral systems. And when dealing with this threat, in my view, sanctions are inappropriate. They're an ineffective response. The other side of this tandem, the cooperation side, in my view, should not be an afterthought. It should not be hostage to vigorous deterrence efforts. The focus should be dual. It should be on small steps in critical issue areas capable of breaking logjams. Ukraine, energy security and pipelines, and other issues of this sort, where small steps are probably the best that one can hope for. But then secondly, also simultaneously on the prerequisites, that's what would be necessary to begin edging toward cooperation on the transcendent challenges, the loss of control over a new multipolar nuclear world, the looming instability and violence from climate change, the risks in the remilitarization of European security, and the consequences of a deepening US-Chinese strategic rivalry. Third and finally, I think the administration needs to re-examine and recalibrate the role of carrots and sticks as policy tools by expanding the tools in the US policy arsenal beyond sanctions and the pillory. This by restoring and invigorating the venues and mechanisms of diplomacy that have shriveled over the last 7 years. Second, by reanimating the most effective of the working groups that were once active under the US-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission and under the NATO-Russia Council. And on the stick side, I think there is a desperate need to rationalize what is now a multi-layered sanctions regime burdened by, in my view, indiscriminate purpose. Then to set priority objectives and focus on the forms of conditionality, that is, conditions by which we would ease sanctions, that would be the most likely to dent Russian resistance. Finally, I believe the message of policy should constantly be that the United States neither wishes nor believes that the relationship must be or should be zero-sum, along with this concrete illustrations of what the rewards could be with Russian cooperation. I finish by saying that some aspects of what I'm urging may have a chance. The framework itself, I believe, no chance at all.
Bob, thank you for that. So our second speaker today is Professor Kimberly Marten, who is a professor of political science, also at Barnard College and the current chair. And she is the author of 4 books, and most recently has been delving into a lot of Russia's global activities, including Russia's activities in Africa. She also teaches a course on Russia and the West. So lots to unpack there. Kim, the floor is yours. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. And thanks to all the other speakers, especially Bob Legvold, for joining us today. So Bob told you what should happen. I'm going to try to predict, which is always dangerous, what I think is likely to happen. And I'll divide my talk into three parts. First of all, highlighting some factors about the Biden administration and their implications. Secondly, talking about cases where I think there might be some cooperation between Russia and the United States. And thirdly, highlighting some areas of conflict. So what do we know about the Biden administration? First, I think we can understand that we should predict steady, predictable outcomes. There's going to be a rebuilding of the State Department, and there's going to be a renewed trust in intelligence agencies. And so in that sense, US policy is going to have a relationship to what it used to look like. The fact that there's Democratic control over both the House and Senate also means that Congress is not going to be leading Russia policy. Biden will be. And that'll be a change from the Trump administration when we saw Congress undoing and trying to push Trump on many different things. And thirdly, Biden has made it very clear that he wants to resume strong ties with longstanding allies and resume multilateralism, so we can presume that the United States is not going to be acting on its own towards Russia. So steady, predictable outcomes. Secondly, we know that Biden is going to be appointing an experienced foreign policy team with a lot of Obama-era experience. And I would argue that Russia has not fundamentally changed in the past 4 years, and that what we've been seeing is that Putin's regime has just become more and more crystallized, that Russian foreign policy is deepening or accelerating trends that were already clear by late 2016. And so that experience will come in handy. A key post has already been filled with Victoria Nuland as Biden's hopeful appointee for Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She's known as being a relative hardliner on Russia. Her family is close to Secretary of State appointment Antony Blinken, and that means she may have a powerful role in the administration. Her boss, Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, has also spoken out forcefully against Putin's recent actions. So that gives us one sense of direction. But keep in mind that many Russian-related positions are left to fill in the Pentagon, in the State Department, and most notably the ambassador. And that might actually be a sign that Biden is not prioritizing Russia. He's concentrating on other areas of the world, and Russia is not so much central to his thinking. And then thirdly, keep in mind that there's an ideology behind this team. They've written and given interviews frequently, and so we know what their views are, that US interests are based on multilateral institutions, on democracy promotion, and on anti-corruption. And Antony Blinken in particular has called this a league of democracies. They fundamentally see the world as threatened by a coalition of corrupt authoritarian states. They believe the US should resume leadership of a new version of what we might call the free world against this authoritarian threat. And there's a fundamental belief that interests and values cannot be separated from each other, and that in the American experience, they go together. So that's what the Biden administration brings in. Where do I see potential cooperation? Russia has kind of uniformly said, oh no, there's no reset, there's going to be a lot of conflict. But I think there could be at least some cooperation. First, it's likely to start with a win-win outcome, which is the effort to extend New START by 5 years. And I think this matters not just for the New START treaty per se on nuclear weapons, but also it's an indication that the Biden administration is going to prioritize discussion of other nuclear and conventional issues involved in strategic stability thinking. It means that we may have the kinds of arms control relationships that we had back in the Cold War, where arms control is prioritized as an issue. Secondly, the Biden administration is going to need to act quickly to get Iran back on any kind of a nuclear limitation agreement, which Biden has said is a priority. And it's going to be very helpful to the Biden administration if they can get Russian help on that, given the level of Russian cooperation with Iran. So I think we might see some quiet cooperation with Russia on the Iranian nonproliferation issue. And finally, climate change is a big part of the Biden agenda, and we have seen that Russia also has climate change as a big part of its agenda, both in terms of the expansion of commercial trade possibilities in the northern Arctic sea route across the top of Russia, and also because of the permafrost melt that's happening in many of the large industrial cities in Russia's far north. And I think this gives us some hope that there might be an expansion of cooperation in what's called the Arctic Council, which is a cooperative venue, which is often not given sufficient attention. During the Trump administration, it started moving in a direction of being militarized because of statements that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made there. But the charter of the Arctic Council specifically prohibits it from talking about military issues. And so it might be a way where we could talk about Arctic trade issues and Arctic environmental issues with Russia in a cooperative basis and sort of stick the military competition issues off towards the side. It was a venue that Obama did make a lot of effort towards, and that might mean that Biden does as well. Where do I see confrontation? Like Bob, I see it on cyber issues. I think Putin made a terrible mistake by intensifying cyber threats against the United States with the SolarWinds software attack in mid-2019, becoming operational in spring 2020, because there was such intrusion into so much of US key infrastructure, apparently including industrial control systems. And while sometimes this has been portrayed in the media as just being about espionage, every expert that I've seen talk about this believes that it potentially planted a software key that could be turned to ensure chaos in US systems. So I think it's much more serious than just espionage. And I think Putin cooked his own goose. Democrats were already focused on the Russian cyber threat because of the 2016 election hacking documents. And I think this has just ensured it's very unlikely to be any soon cooperation on cyber issues because of the incredible distrust that Russia has brought into the relationship. So Dmitry Trenin and some other Russian actors have talked about the kind of thing that Bob mentioned, this cyber summit to talk about these things. I don't see that happening politically. I think Putin ensured that that will actually not happen. Secondly, I think there'll be a focus on growing Russian domestic repression. And I think that this could actually become like the Obama era conflict on steroids over what's happening in terms of Russian domestic policy. Let me say one thing about a special case of the attack on Alexei Navalny, and that was the use of banned chemical weapons from the Novichok nerve agent class, which really solidifies the notion among the Biden administration, that Putin is a rogue actor. There was actually one quiet diplomatic success that happened in late 2019 with Russia, which was the addition of some Novichok weapons to the Chemical Weapons Convention treaty list. And that makes it even more shocking that Putin would use this weapon against Navalny, because it might mean that the United States could bring a challenge inspection of Russian chemical weapons facilities as a result of this. And I'm grateful to Dave Southworth for bringing that to my attention. But do keep in mind that if they were to use the Chemical Weapons Convention, Russia could tell the US that they'd have to provide full information about the investigation leading to the challenge, and the United States might not want to do that. Do I see any real hope of forward movement on Ukraine? No. Biden was one of the first people to recommend that the US send weapons to Ukraine. He has very strong support from the Polish American and Ukrainian American communities. I think there'll be a lot of US effort towards Ukraine, but I don't think it's going to be easy to have an agreement with Russia on Ukraine. And I'll stop there.
Kim, thanks so much. You covered a lot, and certainly appreciate the insights, both domestic and international. And our next speaker is Tim Frye. Tim is the current Marshall D. Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia, also Director of the International Center for the Study of Institutions Development at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, former Director of the Institute. Also author of the forthcoming book, Weak Strong Man, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia, and not giving anything away, saying that Tim was saying he was rewriting his comments over the past weekend in response to what was happening in Russia. But Tim, thanks so much also for joining us, and the floor is yours. We're especially interested in your insights about the domestic situation in Russia and how to deal with it.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Yes, I agree with Bob that Russian foreign policy is driven by a mixture of goals, including forces emanating from Russia's domestic politics, but also that the Kremlin responds to international opportunities, it responds to the behavior of other actors, and it responds to global issues. So it's not solely driven by domestic politics, but that's what Alex asked me to talk about. So that's where I'm going to devote most of my attention today. I want to make 3 points about the link between domestic politics and Russian foreign policy, and they're all somewhat controversial, and I don't have enough time to give them a lot of nuance, but I do hope they spark some discussion. So one common view is that Russia's more assertive policy is really driven by Putin's ex-KGB background or Russia's history and culture. But I think if we look at Russia as a modern autocracy, we see that regardless of leader background or national history, many countries like Russia adopt anti-Western stances in the language of being a victim, of being a besieged fortress surrounded by enemies. If we look at speeches by Orban in Hungary, by Erdogan in Turkey, by Chavez in Venezuela, this is really a common thread. So this language of victimhood is something that is not inherent or unique to Russia. It is a broader phenomenon that we see in lots of modern autocracies. Certainly, Russia's global footprint is much larger than these other autocracies, so it merits more attention. But I also think this approach, I think, can help tamp down the view that Russia is somehow inherently or uniquely anti-Western by saying, look, this is a feature of modern autocratic systems rather than a bug. And it does mean that there's some headwind in working towards better relations. But it also doesn't mean that good relations with Russia are not possible, or better relations with Russia are not possible. Second, there's a common view that Putin has brought Russia back on the global stage and the Russian people love him for it. This is certainly true with respect to Crimea. Crimea was a low-risk, high-reward operation that was popular across all demographic groups in Russia, and it boosted Putin's support for 4 years, which is a remarkable length of time. At the same time, if we look beyond Crimea to other issues, support for a more assertive policy is not that great, even as the Kremlin has promoted this argument with great vigor. For example, support for operations in eastern Ukraine have always been relatively weak. In May 2014, when fighting in eastern Ukraine was pretty hot, actually, only 31% of Russians supported sending direct military assistance to eastern Ukraine, and this figure fell to 20% a year later. Putin may believe that it's inconceivable for Russia and Ukraine to live apart, but last fall, 82% of Russians said that Ukraine should have its own state. Support for the Syrian intervention has never been great. In early 2017, just 30% of Russians thought that the Kremlin should continue operations, and 1 in 2 favored ending them. Only a quarter of Russians think that Belarus should be part of Russia. Also, the Levada Center for every year for the last decade has asked Russians whether they would prefer to have a country that was considered among the economically developed countries, or a country that was more a superpower. So when forced to make this trade-off between being economically developed or being a global superpower, and every year except for 2014, they've sided in favor of greater economic development than being a global power. Even attitudes towards the US, I think, are a lot more complicated than people realize. In my own research, I found that US sanctions towards the Kremlin did not produce a rally around the flag effect and increase Putin's support, even as they did reduce support for the US among Russians. But I think if we look more broadly, popular attitudes towards the United States are driven by lots of factors, including by the behavior of the United States. And if we look back over the last decade, the performance of Western democracies has not been all that enviable and has not provided a great alternative model to Russia. And I think that is driving some of the negative views among Russians toward the United States. The third point is we have a common view that Putin is playing a weak hand well, but I also think that part of the reason why Putin has a weak hand is a more assertive foreign policy, and that there's really just a real tension between a more assertive foreign policy and economic development. If we think that autocratic leaders have two constituencies, their inner circle of elites who benefit from being close to power, but also provide the possibility for overthrowing the leader, and a mass public which also threatens the leader and that they can take to the street, as we saw over the weekend. But both of these groups are antagonized by prolonged economic stagnation. So I do think that Putin has an interest in keeping the Russian economy at least afloat. and the notion that the sole purpose of the Russian economy, of Putin, is just to extract as much resources from the economy as he can, I think is misguided in that Russian economic performance has been remarkably stable as Putin has had to navigate between these two different groups. The problem is that this more assertive foreign policy, though, rewards the groups that are benefiting most from the current bad economic status quo: the security services, import competing firms, budget workers, and the well-connected. This assertive foreign policy makes it hard to boost growth and reduce corruption, which are really important for Russian global power looking forward. So Putin is playing a weak hand well, but his foreign policy is also keeping his hand somewhat weak. So how should the U.S. respond to Russian politics? On the positive side, I think the U.S. now will have one Russian policy rather than two, which will be an improvement over the last 4 years. Also, if personnel is policy, I think that we can label the Biden team Putin skeptics, maybe strong Putin skeptics, but also not Putin phobes. Right now, the Biden team is reviewing election interference in 2020 elections, the SolarWinds hack, Navalny's poisoning, and alleged U.S. bounties, and is deciding how to react. This seems to me to be a too reactive policy. I would prefer to see more kinds of agenda-setting steps rather than responding to what Russia is doing. If we look at Russian domestic politics and how U.S. policy should be viewing this issue, I think it's really important to reach out to the Russian public, to promote exchanges, perhaps to extend visa-free travel for young Russians. If the Kremlin says no, they should be forced to explain why not. These are things that should be the normal order of business. But I also think it's really important to lead by example. I mean, the Russian public has long experience in interpreting propaganda and will react badly to any kind of heavy-handed appeals. And that the best way to support those who share our value in Russia is to live up to them in our own domestic politics, to recognize some humility, to recognize that it's hard to build and maintain a democracy, as recent events in the US have shown. Thank you.
Great, Tim. Thanks so much for that. So moving on to our final panelist of the day is Dr. Elise Giuliano, who is a lecturer in political science here at Columbia University, also director of graduate studies at the Harriman Institute, and teaches courses on Russian politics as well. Elise, the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this very interesting panel. I'd like to start with some general comments about the Ukraine crisis and then move down to the nitty-gritty of US policy. Now that the war in Donbass is in its 6th and nearly 7th year, the centrality of the Ukraine crisis to US-Russian relations may seem less immediate than it once was. Rex Tillerson, when he was Trump's Secretary of State, moved from a position that all issues in the Russian-US bilateral relationship hinged on the resolution of the crisis to the position that US policy should not be handcuffed if Ukraine and Russia can work things out themselves. But regardless of this view, there is a strong argument that the Ukraine crisis continues to be central to the abysmal state of the Russian-American relationship today, and more broadly, of course, to European security. By extension, how the US reacts to what is happening in Belarus, another sovereign country situated between Russia and Western Europe, is also key for the future relationship between Russia and the West. Why? Russia's decision to annex Crimea and its aggressive military action in East Ukraine represented a momentous change in Russia's acceptance of the post-Cold War order in Europe. Its choice to continue that policy reveals the deep, if not incommensurate, difference in perceptions between the US and Russia concerning Euro-Atlantic security institutions and, above all, NATO. As we have seen since 2014, this disagreement infects and endangers many aspects of the US-Russian relationship, including the likelihood of a renewed arms race, or even nuclear confrontation. So 6 years have now passed, during which time Russia has borne high costs, economic costs from European and US sanctions, the financial costs of absorbing Crimea into the Federation, reputational costs for Russia, especially in Europe, and certainly in the aftermath of the downing of civilian airline MH17, plus the challenge of managing the leaders of the DNR and LNR, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, who do not always behave like good proxy actors should, but have developed their own interests and agencies. Yet Russia remains militarily engaged in Ukraine, and Putin has been unwilling to pursue diplomatic solutions to bring the confrontation to an end, even following the election of Zelensky as president of Ukraine, which offered an opportunity for a diplomatic opening. So an important question is, how will the Biden administration interpret the fact of Russia's resolve to continue the conflict? And how does it understand the fact of Russia's annexation of Crimea and military engagement in Ukraine in the first place? Will the Biden administration interpret Russia's actions as an extreme but more or less isolated policy taken with regard to Ukraine in particular, perhaps due to Russia's nationalist views about the Ukraine-Russian relationship or particular nationalist understandings of Russians living in Ukraine? And if so, does the US expect Russia to pursue further military encroachment on Ukrainian territory and perhaps annex the Donbass region as it did Ukraine? Or does the US and the Biden administration view Russia's goals more broadly as an attempt to disrupt Ukraine's path toward joining Europe and gaining membership in European security and regional associations? So how will the Biden administration respond? For the US, is the Ukraine crisis about expelling Russia from occupied territory in Donbass and ending the war? Is it this and possibly more? Will Biden use the Ukraine crisis to address the question of the relative influence that Russia and the US should have in Ukraine, as well as in the other states of the so-called in-betweens, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan? And even more broadly, does the US aspire to a resolution with Russia over the issue of the proper role of Russia and the US in Europe? Well, these are rather big considerations for the Biden administration. Victoria Nuland, the incoming Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, mentioned in a Foreign Affairs piece last summer the possibility of discussion between the US and Europe concerning European security institutions, NATO, the EU, and OSCE, along the lines, she wrote, of Medvedev's proposal when he was president, which referred to his interest in broadening the role of a reconstituted OSCE as a way to move beyond the dominance of NATO in Europe. Some scholars and policy analysts in the US and in Europe have argued for the need for a substantial recasting of the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe that would bring the sovereign states of Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan into a new regional order without forcing them to choose between one or another of the two great powers. So these, as I said, are large considerations for members of the Biden administration. Now, on a more concrete level and in line with past policy, many observers, especially Ukrainians, assume and hope that Biden will continue the policy of strong support for Ukraine that he embodied as Obama's point person on Ukraine prior to the Trump presidency. And it's likely that Biden will pick up where he left off when he was vice president. At that time, he traveled to Ukraine multiple times. He worked with Poroshenko's government to enact reforms promoting the rule of law and economic reform. So it's likely that US engagement with domestic reform in Ukraine will continue. There are many ongoing US programs that support Ukrainian sovereignty and economic development, including programs run by USAID, which have promoted small business development and provided humanitarian assistance to people affected by the war in East. In addition, one of Biden's present-day policies that he has articulated with regard to Russia, the reduction of influence of oligarchic corruption within the US and in general, applies equally well to Ukrainian oligarchs. And this just represents a continuation of policies that had begun prior to the current administration, of course, but maybe had stalled for one reason or another, such as the Justice Department's filing of charges against Ukrainian oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky for alleged money laundering via real estate properties in Louisville, Kentucky, in Texas, and in Cleveland. And the ongoing case of Dmitry Firtash, another powerful Ukrainian oligarch who has been awaiting extradition to the US to face charges of bribery. So it's likely that these cases will move forward under Biden. The Biden administration also needs to consider on a more concrete level what it can learn or decide what it has learned from US actions during the past few years. For example, what does it make of the Trump administration's decision to create the position of special envoy and send Kurt Volker to Ukraine? Was it an effective policy? Not in my opinion. And then it was cut short by the Ukraine scandal and Trump's interference in Ukraine. So would it attempt something like that again? We'll have to wait and see. And then the big question of whether the US should attempt to become re-involved in the Minsk negotiations to end the war itself. Would pressure from the US have an effect, a salutary effect on Russia's negotiating position, or are the Minsk negotiations better left to the Europeans and the trilateral contact group made up of Ukraine, Russia, and the OSCE, while the US sticks to quiet behind the scenes diplomacy? Finally, the issue of military assistance. Last summer, the Department of Defense awarded Ukraine a $250 million security assistance package, which includes mobile radar systems designed to detect and track incoming artillery and rocket fire, ambulances, communications equipment, and patrol boats armed with remote controlled cannons. These Pentagon funds were part of the same funds that Trump froze in a bid to pressure Zelensky to announce an investigation into then candidate Joe Biden, an action, of course, which led to the impeachment of Trump. And the fact that the funds are allocated and are moving forward under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative suggests the broad bipartisan support for Ukraine, as well as support within parts of the executive branch. So the Biden administration is coming into office with, contrary to what we observed more narrowly within the Trump presidency or the office of the president, with broad support for Ukraine in general at the domestic front and strengthening its sovereignty, and also broad support against, in terms of military assistance of various kinds toward the goal of ending the war. So the question is whether we'll just kind of continue with these policies and possibly use the opportunity to engage in a broader discussion about what the future of the Euro-Atlantic security institutions in Europe should look like. Thank you.
Elise, thanks so much. And thanks for focusing on Ukraine too. We've already have a few questions about Ukraine. So let's open it up to the Q&A and delve right into it. And the first question is from Oleg Solkin from VOA's Russian service, who's asking a question about Navalny. He asked, would it mean a morally ambiguous action for the Biden administration to include the Navalny case into the package of urgent issues to discuss with the Kremlin? The visible alternative might be to set the Navalny issue aside and consider a bunch of straightforward sanctions under the Magnitsky Act, including sanctions on Putin himself. What do the panels think? Should Navalny be an issue in this basket of high-profile issues, the way some countries are making it out to be? Who wants to take a stab at this first? Kim, please.
Yeah, thank you. The Biden administration has said, not all that loudly, but quietly, that they do want to re-examine the way that sanctions have been used. And so I think there is a possibility that the response to what has happened with Navalny might be something other than sanctions. We don't know that for sure. There's certainly a lot of pressure coming from Congress to put additional sanctions because of Navalny. But I think that that is something that is not yet definite. And it's kind of telling that Biden has not yet announced what he's going to do on the Navalny issue, even though it's been sort of high on the agenda.
Great, thanks. Tim?
Yeah, I would say that I think we have to look at the Navalny arrest as part of a broader trend in Russian politics of increasing political restrictions, and to have U.S. policy not be solely focused on Navalny per se, but on broader issues. I want to highlight, and actually, what I think will happen is because of the use of Novichok, one path by which sanctions could happen is through the chemical weapons treaty, which would be a justification for introducing some kinds of sanctions. I think that would, given what I know about the team around Biden, that is, I think, a likely course of action. I want to say one thing. The Biden statement on protests in Russia, the last line says the U.S. will stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies and partners in defense of human rights, whether in Russia or wherever they come under threat. And this use of the term allies in Russia, I think is something that the Russian side has picked up on and might have not been the best turn of phrase. I think one could have just said, we stand up for those people who share our values, and not given away a kind of a free talking point for the Kremlin. More generally, I think this kind of anti-Western card that the Putin administration has been playing and trying to paint Navalny as a dupe of the CIA, I think that's really getting diminishing returns, because it has just been the response to every single problem in Russia. There's a pothole in Omsk. This must have something to do with the CIA. The economy's slowing down. It's because of the sanctions, and blaming the West for every problem in Russia is something that I think brings diminishing returns over time.
And just if I could follow up just quickly from Katrina Vandenheuvel, who's joining us today. Thank you, Katrina. She's asking about the nature of these protests. Are they anti-corruption protests and demos? But how much do we know about economic protests, whether they're for pension wage increases, food increases, and job losses? And then a related comment that she has, Tim, is, or question, and Russian internet so far has been relatively free, but what are the prospects for seeing a crackdown on the internet, as well as we're seeing a crackdown on journalism? Where do you see the tea leaves there?
2 points. Until recently, throughout the Putin years, economic protest has been actually fairly common in Russia. There's one database which kind of logs these things and shows that every year there are 1,000, 2,000 protests around delivery of social benefits or around the economy that don't necessarily raise political issues. Now, one concerning thing is the recent restrictions on political activity in Russia suggest that maybe even these types of protests that are not directed at political concerns also might be strictly limited, and this would give one less opportunity for the Putin administration to learn about the mass public and for the mass public to try to influence policy, which would be a problem. Also, yes, the internet has remained free, and you can that Navalny's video has been seen more than 80 million times in the span of a week, suggests that that this is still a very viable tool for the Russian opposition. But recently the Kremlin has also increased fines for slander and for and tried to kind of restrict and pressure TikTok to take down videos related to the protests. So we might be seeing a more restrictive policy towards social media in Russia. And it's not clear whether this will actually be enforced or not, and that's something we'll have to keep an eye on.
Great, thanks. And move on to a next question from Russell Gayushev. And why don't we ask Bob to take first whack at this? Is there a chance that modern Russia isn't just a proxy of China, rather than an independent player with ambitions of world domination? Every involvement of Russia in conflicts, usually they have sided with China. And I think, Bob, you've been interested in the strategic triangle for some time now, US, Russia, Chinese relations imbalance. And there was a strand of thinking during the Trump administration amongst those that wanted to see if they could reach out to China in an attempt to balance a bit against, reach out to Russia to balance a bit against China. How do you see the nature of that strategic triangle now in the position that the Biden administration is in? You're on mute, Bob.
I think the Biden administration in general terms begins where the Trump administration left off, but with a very major difference. That is, both administrations had come to see China as the primary challenge. I think the Trump administration was framing that already as an adversary, and therefore the relationship was strategic, it was military, and so on. And the technology, all the other things were built into that national security threat. It's quite clear from Blinken's confirmation hearings, from the other things they've said, that the Biden administration also sees China as the primary challenge, the primary problem. But they don't want to deal with it in the same fashion, in part because you may have noticed in the debate when Biden was pressed on the comparison of the two, he treated his phrase for the Russians where they are an opponent. And in the case of China, he called that a competitor. And therefore, I don't think they want to push it hard in the adversarial direction. But the notion that China is now the number one challenge, I think is no question. How does Russia then fit into that in terms of the Biden administration? I think there is a general sensitivity that some of US policy determines the degree to which the two countries turn to one another in an anti-American or anti-US fashion. I think there's also a recognition that given the parallels, whether it's in the nature of the political systems, the character of the political leaderships, the complementarities at an economic level, the parallels in some foreign policy areas, that there's really very little the United States can do to disrupt or draw Russia away from China. Russia is going to have a developing relationship with China. And the real issue for US policy is that what the Chinese and the Russians call a strategic partnership of cooperation. That's the current formulation for their relationship. The important thing is that as a result of US behavior, that's not turned into a hostile anti-American alliance between the two of them. That's really the chore of US policy at this point.
Bob, thanks so much. So we have a few questions on Ukraine. I'm going to bundle them in a way. One came over YouTube from Ambassador Valery Kuczynski, who asks about the prospects of strengthening the US-Ukrainian strategic partnership under new administration. And then so happy to see our friend and colleague Volodya Dubovic joining us too. And he asks a similar question, even if there are no big changes with regard to US-Russia differences in Ukraine, are any small steps feasible and what might they be? So Elise, and then maybe Kim, if you'd like to weigh in on that too. But Elise, what do you think about the prospects for sort of incremental steps on Ukraine?
Hi, thanks for those questions. And hello virtually, even though I can't see you, to the questioners. So I guess I would like to see what happens when the Biden team gets together and starts discussing these issues with each other, since they're possibly coming to them with different prior evaluations of like I said during my comments, the deeper significance of the Ukraine crisis, as well as the effectiveness of certain of the U.S. policies, in particular military aid to Ukraine, and in particular the role of the U.S. in the negotiations over Minsk. And you know, the U.S. has kind of taken a backseat in recent years. And it might, okay, so my gut is that maybe it's going to let that play out a little bit longer because of what's happened recently in Ukraine with regard to the Normandy format and the ceasefire that was signed last year. The trilateral group was somewhat successful in agreeing to a ceasefire, although of course it's a ceasefire that's been violated. For the most part, the number of casualties has declined, and both sides have respected the ceasefire up into the present. And that's really the first time that that's happened. So I might, if I want to predict, I might predict that the U.S. will kind of let the Zelensky presidency kind of continue to play out those negotiations through the trilateral group, and then see what happens if things stall over the course of the next year in that venue, and then maybe try to take a greater role.
Great, thanks. Kim, would you like to weigh in on this? And then we'll go to Bob too. Thanks.
Sure, just a couple points. The first is that my understanding is that under the Obama administration, the US had volunteered to be involved in the Normandy format, and that Russia was not interested in having that US involvement. And so that might be sort of a limit on exactly how much there can be US cooperation with the Normandy format per se. But I would say that in general, I think if there is some kind of a US special diplomat in that area, it's going to be much more coordinated with the European allies than it would have been under the Trump administration. There'll be an effort to make a joint effort in whatever is done. But that secondly, I think something we need to keep in mind is that Zelensky came into office being very much, in favor of anti-corruption and cleaning up the oligarchs. And with time, we're starting to see the real limits that Zelensky has faced, and we're not seeing the level of change in Ukraine that people were hopeful for a couple years ago. So if the Biden administration continues to push Ukraine in an anti-corruption direction, that might actually limit the amount that it has influence over Ukraine politically on various things, because those political goals are not necessarily going to be aligned with each other. So just some things for us to think about in terms of US influence.
Great, thanks for that. Bob, do you have thoughts on the Ukraine issue?
I do. First of all, in terms of the Biden administration and the approach, I think there's going to be a fundamental continuity between the Obama administration on Ukraine and the Biden administration, and not the least because the president himself was deeply involved with the Ukrainian issue. I mean, he's the only senior official from the United States that's actually visited Ukraine. I think, what was the total? 4, 5, 6 times? 5 times, Elise says. And he knows the problems. He knows what we were struggling with, both in terms of Donbass and Minsk II, and above all else, the set of issues that Kim just referred to, the domestic reform and what needs to be done at that level. My assumption is based on what they've been saying. Again, I go back to the testimony in the confirmation hearing by Blinken when he was pressed on the Ukrainian issue, and he made plain that they would be supportive. They would continue to insist on implementation of Minsk II. He applauded the assistance, the lethal assistance had been granted. He stressed what kind of appropriation had been made for security assistance, and then he turned to Kim's issue of domestic change within. And how old is that issue now? There was hope around the new Zelensky regime or the new Zelensky leadership. As Kim says, there's disappointment at that level. That's not to underestimate the kind of progress that has been made. There has been real progress in Ukraine, and the trick will be to support Ukraine in terms of what they've done and then what has not been accomplished. But I see that as essential continuity. And that second side is likely to run into, what did we say 2 or 3 years ago? What did we call it? Ukraine fatigue. Ukraine fatigue on the part of the EU, Ukraine fatigue on the part of the Germans, on the part of the United States. Now here, the second thing, I apologize for going on. This is a renegade's position. I recognize my position is out of the box in this context, but I start by assuming that Minsk II with its full integrity is never going to be implemented. If the Russians don't want to implement an agreement that's basically in their favor, and the Ukrainians politically at the leadership are incapable of doing it for political reasons, full form, I don't think that then is the right point of departure. So I would very quickly frame the issue differently. I don't know that there's much of a chance of doing it What I'm about to say, I did raise with a very senior Russian policymaker 2 years ago. And at first, he was sort of waving me off, but then he listened, and there was some response. This official, of course, has no direct influence over Russia policy. It tells you no sense of what real chance there would be with Putin and those around Putin. My thought would be that you ought to start with a different envelope and fit Minsk II and those portions that you might make progress in to a larger envelope. And that larger envelope would be normalizing Russia-Ukrainian relations, a process supported by, advocated by, and supported by the outside, by the Europeans with its Normandy, or by the individual key bilateral players, and by the United States. And what might that consist of? It might consist of security assurances providing Ukraine with guaranteed access through the Kerch Canal and to their ports within Ukraine. Earlier, it might have been working out arrangements for water supply to Crimea, but the Russians now seem to be attacking that individually. Third, it might involve the reestablishment of some industrial ties, including within the defense area, that have been broken or cut off. Within that, Minsk II and its part have to be part of it. There has to be progress on solidifying the ceasefire. There has to be progress on providing for humanitarian assistance. There has to be progress toward moving Ukraine toward more assured control over the border. There has to be progress toward minimizing or diminishing Russian support. But in terms of the full implementation of Minsk, I don't think that's the way we're going to go. But I finish where I started. I don't think the Biden administration is open to that. I think they're basically operating within a framework that formed in a very informed fashion in the Obama administration.
Great, thank you, Bob. I want to stay in the realm of foreign relations for one more round of questions, and we'll go to Kim, combine a couple of questions from Fadi Hilani and Natasha Udensova, which is, how should the Biden administration handle or engage with Russia on the question of Syria, and let's throw in Libya too, if you would like to take that, and Russia's involvement in these areas, Kim?
So those are so complex. Let me just say a couple of things. The first is that Biden has made it clear that he does not want to have large military deployments abroad if it's not necessary. So I don't expect that there would be a ramping up of the conflict in either of those areas. We just got news recently that in Libya, the Wagner troops are building a deep trench in between the two areas of Libya that are controlled on the one hand by the UN recognized government, and on the other hand by the government that Russia is supporting, the rebel government that is associated with the old Gaddafi people in many ways. So it looks like Libya is going to be a very difficult situation going forward. There's not going to be any peace agreement there. I'm not sure how much the US is going to become involved in that at all. I think one very serious problem in Syria has been what the US has called increasing levels of aggression against US troops that are there in support of the Kurdish allies in the sort of the eastern part of the country. And I think based on what Biden has been saying about this analysis that he wants to have of how Russia has been putting bounties on the heads of US forces in Afghanistan and so forth, I think there's probably going to be no withdrawal from the US on that point. And if there is any conflict that happens, it'll probably be on that issue of the US insisting that it has the right to support its allies in Syria in a way that had been agreed with by Russia, and to push back on what had been some, in the last several months in particular, increasing Russian military aggression against US forces in Syria.
Great, thanks for that. Let's switch tracks into the domestic sphere again. And Tim, for you, there's a question about the video call with students on the holiday that was celebrating the school year. And this particular question from Mandy Cattell focuses on Putin criticizing street protests historically and saying such consequences, the consequences of such protests can be dire. Do you read that he's criticizing revolution itself, more narrowly, the means of protest? And I'd also be curious, talking about that video call conference, of your reactions on when he was put on the spot about who owns the dacha, right? And he was, sort of furiously denied it. No, it's my shell companies, like not me, actually. So be curious to get your readout on that. And then Elise, we'll go back to you for your thoughts on that too. Oh, you're on mute.
sorry. I think the important thing was less Putin's response than the fact that he was forced to respond publicly and discuss this issue, which I'm sure he would have preferred to ignore. And had Navalny's campaign been less successful, he would have been able to ignore. And more broadly, Putin, the two keys to Putin's power has been he's been a very popular leader for a long time. The economy doubled in his first 10 years. Then the annexation of Crimea included a boost for the next 4 years. But the last 5 years, the administration, I think, has really lost the narrative. Economic growth has been flat for a decade. And there's a lot of, I think, Putin fatigue more generally within Russia. And it's not that the Putin regime is going to fall tomorrow or the economy is going to collapse. The 1% growth over a long period of time is not to be envied, but it does suggest that there is some concern for at least having a modicum of economic progress. But it does seem like Putin has kind of lost the narrative. And if we think that Putin is playing a weak hand well, I think Navalny is playing an even much, much weaker hand incredibly well, given the forces that are arrayed against him, and that he's been able to have such an impact on Russian politics. I think I have to give him credit for that.
Super. Elise, do you want to weigh in on that too?
Yeah, I would just say that it's particularly challenging for the Biden administration to take office and think about a broader Russian policy when there is this immediate crisis in terms of what to do about recognizing Navalny, and especially challenging because here we're going to just focus on Putin for a second. Let's keep in mind how Putin feels about protests and what he's been facing, in addition to everything that Tim just mentioned, that's really put him back on his heels, including coronavirus. Is the fact that Russia has experienced some of the longest and ongoing protests in the city of Khabarovsk since last summer. And some of those protests turned into anti-Putin protests. And then in addition to that, he's been observing this spectacle of mass mobilization in Belarus. And what happened the last time there was the spectacle of mass mobilization in a neighboring post-Soviet state in Ukraine? Putin reacted very emotionally, very defensively, and dramatically by annexing Crimea. So, I think that even though Putin's a rational actor, sometimes he has this ability to become very emotionally reactive and take decisions quickly and dramatically. And so I think that, we have to give some thought to his emotional state, considering that he's been observing one of his great fears, massive protests in the neighborhood and in his own country, and now feels this more imminent and directly threatening series of, one day so far, protests, perhaps a series of ongoing protests coming from opposition figure Navalny. What does that mean for his ability? How will he react first domestically, but then what does it mean for his evaluation of the U.S. and the U.S. position? It doesn't seem like an auspicious beginning for the U.S. to try to engage Russia right now.
And Elise, we just stay with you for Peter Clement's question about Belarus from the Lukashenko perspective, and especially his dependence on Moscow for survival. I know you've been following the issue intensely. You've organized several fora here at the Harriman Institute on Belarus. What are your thoughts about how Belarusian-Russian relations are going to evolve here? Will Russia seek to leverage the political situation to advance greater economic integration? What's Lukashenko's endgame, especially given the fact that you have some uncertainty here as to what Biden position is on Belarus?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Lukashenko's endgame is always to stay in power, of course, but it's a question of how long he can continue to maintain that position. And Russia doesn't really have any really great choices when it comes to Belarus, because it doesn't want to be seen as supporting mass protests against Lukashenko, and it doesn't really want to be seen as supporting a leader who uses so much force against the population. And also with regard to protests in Russia, Putin has been very careful not to use inordinate force thus far against protesters. So Putin has been trying to stay out of it, maybe doing some behind the scenes advising and trying to let things just kind of die down and ride it out. But again, will the US make something out of backing Belarus and sort of turning Belarus into a country that needs to make a geopolitical choice between the West and Russia? If that's the case, then how will Russia react? There's a lot of unknowns here on all sides, right? There's a lot of unknowns about how Russia would react if the US moved in that direction. And I think the US is aware of that and is maybe being a little bit cautious in not escalating the protests in Belarus and turning them into a geopolitical crisis. But I would just say that, to have this many ongoing crises in the region is surprising even for our region, and is really a big challenge for Putin to deal with at the time, and of course for the Biden administration to kind of decide how to approach everything. So hopefully, the Biden administration has has given thought to and taken into consideration a lot of the developments of the past few years in the region, and even how some analysts and scholars have evaluated these developments and figured out what it can learn from mistakes that the US may have, or kind of positions that the US may have quartered itself into by focusing on geopolitical aspects of.
It's a really interesting point, and I would invite Bob and Kim too, if they have thoughts on this, in sort of the shifting framing and politics of the so-called near abroad. And we've come from a year where we've had significant protests, government collapse in Kyrgyzstan, this mobilization in Belarus. We've had an entire war in Nagorno-Karabakh that resulted essentially in a Russian-Turkish condo, the bypassing of Minsk and the OSCE, if you want to call it the post-Cold War structure. But at the same time, these weren't framed in this East versus West kind of dynamic, not broadly. Some actors tried to do that, which strikes me as very different than 2014 or 2004. So I'd be curious, how do you see, especially with Biden's team going over, are we going to see a renewed kind of battle over the so-called, sovereignty and independence of the post-Soviet space, or are we ready to view these conflicts through a different lens at the moment? Bob, do you want to pick up on that?
Alex, I think you've identified how much things are different today from what they were before very well. In my view, there are two large overarching propositions. One is this flurry of this flow of destabilizing developments within the post-Soviet space that Elise referred to and that you've identified. They have different character. What we saw happening in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh and then the Russian role is a very different kind of instability or change or discontinuity from, say, Belarus or some of the changes within Central Asia. But as you said, that's no longer, almost none of them with the possible exception of Belarus. Well, Belarus, yes, is in an East-West context. So the first large point is which of these or something else will really blow up in a way in which involuntarily the larger international community gets drawn in one fashion or another. They have to react one way or another. But my argument would be on the other side of it. I believe that Russia, post-Soviet space, all of the issues around those are really going to be second tier issues for the Biden administration. They just don't have the bandwidth to develop a highly active agenda addressing those issues. I agree with what Tim said earlier. It would be a good idea if the administration had an agenda setting foreign policy as opposed to simply reacting. But I think it's essentially going to be reacting, and I believe the reacting is going to be low key until the events themselves no longer permit that. and force them to react in some larger sense.
Thanks for that. Kim, to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think this point relates back to the earlier question about Libya and Syria, in that in all of these things, the major axis of events that we're seeing actually involves the Russia-Turkish relationship much more than it involves the United States. And so I think it's unclear what role the United States can play in any of these events that really are about Russia and Turkey working out what kind of a relationship they want with each other in these regions.
And Alex, I would add to Kim's excellent point, there are some signs, there are certainly people who are urging that that's what we should do. We should leave it to Russia and Turkey to work these things out.
Yeah, no, good point. A much different, more, I would say, multipolar world, even within the post-Soviet space than we've seen before. The final question today, and we're almost out of time, but I want to pose this to Tim first, and then others can weigh in. This is from our postdoctoral fellow, Paula Ganga. How has the handling of the pandemic in Russia impacted Putin and his regime? Is the Russian vaccine well received? Has this meant a popularity boost to Putin, especially by comparing it to how much worse the US is doing? How do you see COVID politics affecting your political analysis and prognosis, Tim?
Thanks a lot. A couple of points. One is Russians are notoriously anti-vaccine, very skeptical towards vaccine. If you look at international surveys, Russians are, along with the French, pretty far off the charts in terms of developed countries' views towards vaccine. So there is a great deal of skepticism towards the Sputnik 5 vaccine. That said, I know people who have gotten it, and it does seem to be making some progress. The Putin administration, it's important for them in terms of a legitimating narrative to say, the United States has developed a vaccine, Britain has developed a vaccine, so have we. So that's an important legitimating point. I also think it has had an impact on domestic politics, in that it has frozen a lot of the politics that were in place, like the number of protests, as on the very local level, has gone down, in part because of concerns about the coronavirus. Basically, I think what the Putin administration is hoping for is, once the coronavirus is over, and many analysts expect growth to kick back, pretty substantially in 2021, 2022, energy prices will go back up, and they'll just have to wait this out until the economy starts to put them in a more comfortable position.
Great. Anyone else like to weigh in on how the COVID issue has weighed in Russian politics?
Alex, I think Tim would recognize that there were a couple of aspects of the response which were different from what we'd seen before. If one assumes that the Putin system is the vertical and that they take charge of issues, the strange thing was taking a page out of Trump's book and saying it's up to the local governments to take care of this problem. Secondly, in terms of the effectiveness of the regime response at whatever level, I think the polls show that by and large, this has not added to confidence in Putin along the way. But I think that's short term. And in the longer run, the real issue will be whether they are able to deal with the disease the same way in which the Biden administration, that's the number one criteria now for measuring the immediate success of the Biden administration. The only other thing I would add is that it looks to me as though the Russians and the Chinese coming out of this have developed fairly effective cooperation on the issue of vaccination and on the issue of the coronavirus, but we'll see.
Well, we are out of time. I just want to thank all the panelists for joining us. Bob, Kim, Tim, Elise, thank you so much for your insights and really great analysis. Thank you to the over 100 people who tuned in on Zoom, with more on YouTube. Thank you for sharing your lunch hour to us. And just make a couple of quick announcements for further events. On Thursday, we will have Kate Brown talking about her book on Chernobyl here. And then on Monday, a special Russia public policy joint seminar that we have with the Jordan Center will focus on specifically the issue of Alexei Navalny and the Kremlin. So thanks to you all. Wishing everyone a safe and healthy rest of week and then semester here, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.